Welcome to the Jim Wood Speaker Series. This is a series that was developed to bring professionals, thought leaders to campus to have a conversation with students, whereby you can feel free to ask questions, and this has really worked out very well. As you can see, we have a standing room only, I guess. Not even standing room only crowd today. So thank you for coming. We have a great speaker today. Let me read a few things about Mr. Frank McCloskey. He is a Vice President for Diversity for Georgia Power Company. Frank has been with that company since 1972. Think about that. Nowadays, people say that you change 6 or 8 times during your career. You change careers 3 or 4 times and companies 6 or 8 times. So Frank has been with Georgia Power Company, and Georgia Power Company has really given Frank a total view of how a company that is truly involved in the community, that is truly involved and celebrate diversity work. And so we are excited to have Frank come and share his experience with you. Let me just read a few things about Frank. He, as a Vice President for Diversity for Georgia Power, he oversees the development and implementation of strategies that help sustain a culture of excellence through inclusion by improving leadership and work culture. He chairs the company's Affinity Group Review Board. He serves as a company review officer. Mr. McCloskey started, as I said, in 1972, has served in key capacities. He has been active in many organizations. He has chaired several in the community. For example, he was the chair of the Atlanta Urban League, the Leadership Atlanta Board, etc., etc. So more than any of those things, I had the opportunity to spend about a little over an hour with Frank the other day for lunch. He is just a great human being who is just a wealth of information. So please help me welcome Frank to Clayton State. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Let me just say one more thing.
Okay.
Just as I remembered, please turn off your cell phones. Please put them to vibrate or something, otherwise you know how it would be distracting. So without further ado, Frank, thank you.
Doctor, thank you very much. Dr. Tidwell, thank you for the invitation. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Will Rogers once said that it's not what I know that gets me in trouble. It's what I know that is no longer relevant or I refuse to change. And that's what gets me in trouble. So tonight, I want y'all to hear that, think about that. Even though you may be coming into this room thinking we're talking about diversity, we are, but we're talking about leadership and how diversity and inclusion is affected by it. And that's different than saying we're going to talk about diversity management. This is about management effectiveness affected by diversity and inclusion. And here's why I say that. Because once I say diversity management, unintentionally I've already separated and I've siloed that this is different than excellent management skills. And there's resistance because you're adding to someone's pile of work. It's not being seen as a core function of management. And so as I go through and talk about a lot of things tonight, I really want to have as an outcome that if you can just begin to understand, in order to be an effective manager, in order to build trust with someone, and it doesn't matter what your human dimension of diversity is as a manager or as an employee. As a function of management, something has to happen in that one-on-one relationship between a manager and employee, that there is trust, and trust is from the employee's perspective of that manager. And it's not my good intentions, because I got wonderful good intentions, but I have absolutely created crisis, pain, dysfunction, disengagement with my good intentions. So it's understanding that as a manager, if I can build trust, and we'll talk about what that looks like, because in my belief, in our company's belief, there are specific management skills that we have to apply in order for that to happen. Tonight, what I hope to do in our discussion, and we're going to have a lot of engagement later on, so I want to have maybe 15, 20 minutes of let me just have a stream of consciousness, try to create some context, and maybe 25 minutes into the discussion, can someone, who would be a volunteer to say in 25 minutes, around 5 till 7, give me a signal, then we'll open up for questions and answers. Because I want my comments just to fuel the rest of the discussion. So what I want to do is an outcome that if I can somehow bring logic to something that may be confusing to you at this moment, or if I can bring confusion to something that you think that you're so secure in, that you're so comfortable in, and maybe something I said tonight blew that out of the water. Because I want to broaden your understanding of what effective management skills have to be, in our belief, in a different kind of world going forward. Everybody with me on that? Does that make sense so far? All right. We got to have some broad context for our discussion. So I want to talk about 4 megatrends that, in my opinion, are redefining management and organizational culture. And as a result of that, if you don't understand these megatrends, because these megatrends, no one will outrun the megatrends. So it's not only affecting management, organizational culture, but it's affecting all of us in our room, in our personal lives, our family members, and for us who may have children's children, it's going to be that kind of long-range impact. So let me begin with the megatrends. First one is age demographics. So I'm going to use Georgia Power as an example. The average age at Georgia Power Company is 47 years of age. Tenure, 22 years. And we have low turnover in our company. We have about 4% or less. It's a good company. But if you take those age demographics, if you take a look at the turnover, within the next 10 to 15 years, we have approximately 60 to 65% of our workforce has the opportunity to retire. Now, the economy may have slowed down some of that. But I believe the impact of that will be, instead of a window of 10 years, it's going to be more compressed, because once the economy improves, some of those who may be working today will decide it's time to leave. So it's going to happen sooner and quicker than spread out. If you take the electric utility industry on a whole, 800,000 who are in the electric utility industry, and I'm talking about the core business, the generation, the transmission, the distribution, the customer service, the same age demographics. So as an industry, you have 65% of that workforce walks within the next 10, 15 years. If you back out and look at the age demographics of corporate America, it's the same. It's the same. Easy calculus, there's 85 million approximately boomers of who I identify. There's 45 million Gen X, and there's about 75 million Gen Ys. So it's an hourglass effect. So you can see right away that there's something going on. That workforce is leaving, and guess what? 10 years ago, and this is the second demographic, or the second megatrend, worker shortage. 10 years ago, there was a crossover, and it's the first time in our country's history that there were more jobs than workers. Very incremental. What's happening, though, and if you take a look at Census Bureau information, Conference Board information, that gap is getting wider and wider. Now, I realize, again, in the economy and for those who are trying to find employment, or you see all the folks who have lost employment. I know this doesn't make sense. However, if you play this out over a longer period of time, there will be a beginning labor shortage based on the current workforce, based on skills that are required, who's in the workforce, who's leaving, that by the year 2015 to 2020, you're going to see a 10 to 15 million worker shortage. And by the year 2025, it ramps up to about 20 million, maybe more. So you have this aging workforce, folks are leaving. You have a worker shortage that's getting wider and wider. And the metaphor I use is like a boa constrictor that's just swallowed a mouse. I know this is not too easy, but there's no other mouse coming behind the boa constrictor. So you got the age demographics, pending worker shortage. Third mega trend, the widening economic, educational gap in our country along race and ethnic lines. And let me talk a little bit about that. If you take the number of students today who are in the grades 9 through 12 across America, we're talking about 165 million. Based on current dropout rates, which are becoming alarming, really alarming, 33% of that 165 million will graduate from high school, enter a four-year college, earn a minimum of a BS degree, and graduate from college within 6 years, 33%. So you're talking about a period of 2011 to 2014 where you will have approximately a little over 5 million college graduates entering the labor pool. It's not only the labor pool, that few numbers, but take a look at all the others who did not graduate. So I want you to think about this. Average salary, annual income for a high school dropout is approximately $17,000 a year. If you graduate from high school, the average salary, annual salary, about $26,000, $27,000 a year. Beginning salary for a BS degree, approximately $53,000, $54,000 a year. If you take the difference between dropout, college graduate, and if you stretch that out over 30 years, you're talking about $1 million difference in salary. And for a high school dropout versus a high school graduate, you're talking about a $300,000 differential. Here's what I'm trying to say. What I've just described, the age, the workforce, the dropout rates, what is happening is that we're not going to have enough workers in the pipeline. We are not building a middle class who has an income that's going to help economic development, that's going to have a capacity to propagate the business models that we all may be part of. This is coming at a time when this global competition, and you have all these other economies who are trying to compete against this country. And in my opinion, it is a formula, it's a perfect storm for national security risk. And so as a function of management, as a function of how corporations are redefining themselves, this is not social work, this is not charity work. This is about seeing every single person in this country as a source of talent that somehow we have to get them trained technically, science, math, whether it's 2-year, whether it's technical training. We've got to do something to prepare them to provide performance, productivity so that we can grow our economy. And if not, what's the long-term impact? The last mega trend is the demographic shifts that are occurring in our country. And when you hear these demographic shifts, I really don't want you to think about who's in, who's out. But I want you to hear this from the standpoint of legislation and regulation. What's the impact? So today in the U.S., and these are approximately 300 million citizens in the U.S., current demographics, and again, these are 4 major blocks because we know this is too easy to put them in our demographics in 4 blocks, but Hispanic Latinos represent 14%, African Americans 13%, Asian Americans 5%, whites 68%. Fast forward 2045, when you hear this terminology, minority, majority. First time in our country, really I think maybe in society, that that's going to be the case. So if you fast forward to 2045, you have approximately 438 million in our country. 438 million. The demographics now become the Hispanic move from 14 up to 29% Hispanic Latinos. African Americans 13% to 13%. So even though there's a greater number of African Americans, the percentage remains the same. Asian Americans go from 5 to 9%. Whites go from 68 to 49%. So by rapid calculus, the 142 million increase, 82% of that, or 117 million, is coming from the Hispanic Latino community. Okay, now here's the punchline. Every single day in this country, 50,000 Latinos turn 18, of which 92% are voter eligible. So if you take 7 days a week, 4.3 weeks a month, 12 months a year, and you run the numbers out till 2045, what is the impact from a regulatory impact with that emerging voter? So what's the impact on legislation? So Georgia Power Southern Company, we're a highly regulated industry. 81% of our net income is coming through some form of regulation legislation. So if we're not doing something to understand how do we build trust, because if we don't have high customer service, if we don't have trust with our consumer base, at some point that affects legislation regulation, which is how we earn our net income. So there is for our business, but I want you to think about it, whatever business you're in, all of us are in some form of regulation legislation. So understand what that is. So those are the 4 megatrends: age, worker shortage, this economic educational divide, the legislative impact. That's redefining. So in that, it's going to create a need for management to develop skills that in the past have not been really rewarded or seen as necessary. And by that I'm talking about partnering, collaboration, how I build trust with those that I'm not comfortable with, I don't understand. And it's maybe not from my perspective, but from another person's point of view. And if I'm able to understand that, how do we have transparency? How do I hear opinions and perspectives with someone being honest? And how do I develop capacities to have dialogue without shutting down? And I will tell you, those are management skills that all of you in this room have to understand how to develop. And I will submit, very few corporations are developing those kind of management skills today. You all have to take responsibility to figure out how you do it yourself. So before I move into my stream of consciousness on other learnings that I've had in the last 10 years as the Vice President of Diversity at Georgia Power, 1 or 2 questions around anything that I've said so far. So silence is agreement? All right, does it make the logic? Now here's what I want y'all to do. You all challenge yourself to take a look at those numbers and any other demographics, and you come up with your own conclusion. But have that curiosity to see how you connect the dots. That's how I'm connecting the dots. Those are the conclusions I'm coming to. Do your own work, and then we can talk about, are we seeing it the same way, are we not? But in that, do we come to better outcomes of what we got to do for the future? Yes?
I don't understand how the demographic shifts will affect the political regulation, legislation, how your business.
Well, so the question is, you didn't understand how the demographic shifts affect regulation legislation. When I said about the 50,000 Latinos, so in other words, if the Latino population in our country is going from 14 to 29%, and then when you take a look at any person, anyone who's born in this country, so it doesn't matter if you are documented or not documented, you're born in this country, you're a U.S. citizen. And then when you start thinking about that increase in population, 50,000 Latinos turn 18 every single day, which is voter eligible age, of which 92% are voter eligible of that number. Those are huge numbers that eventually you're going to have people in legislative bodies, regulatory bodies who are Hispanic Latino. And have we built trust in those relationships? Now, one other thing. This is an insight. If you ask most white people, what's the demographics today of, say, the African American? They'll tell you 60%. I'm serious. Because we're hearing minority, majority. And so there is this, I believe, a feeling that I pick up sometimes that, you know what? All we're going to do around corporate America is let the demographics take care of itself. We'll go ahead and increase our population. And because there seems to be resistance, and we're going to get into this whole issue about why there is resistance with corporate initiatives and why white men feel excluded during this, that we're just going to wait you out. But I want to offer this as my insight. I don't buy that, because I'm concerned that the disparate impact for African Americans will not improve, or the positive impact. There will be just as much disparate impact for African Americans with the Hispanic Latino population growing that way, because there's an assumption that everybody's just looped in together. There's agreement. And they're not understanding the mistrust between the African American, the Hispanic Latino community. And I wonder if the Hispanic Latino community have really done their own work around their forms of racism directed toward African Americans. So again, my conclusion, personal conclusion, is that it's not going to be necessarily a good thing for African Americans, because you hear this term browning of America. There's still a difference in this country around the issues of race and African Americans and how that plays out. All right, now, these next, how much time do I have? I got 10 minutes, right? Who's my timekeeper? How much time do I have?
We're already past the 5 minutes.
So you're trying to take the white guy out of my power position here, huh? All right. Let me just give me 5 more minutes. Give me 5 more minutes. The perspectives I'm going to offer, 37 years with Georgia Power, I did not come out of HR. I came out of the operational side. The last 10 years, I've been the Vice President of Diversity, so I've had to do my own personal work around all my forms of prejudice, bias, my own forms of racism, how it played out, because ethically I could not be in this position if I could not be seen as credible by all of those who are not only like me, but who are different than I am, because I'm unusual. For whatever reason. My perspectives are also based on what we're doing at Georgia Power Company, but also I've had the privilege of working with a lot of other corporate diversity officers and other corporations. There's a lot of benchmarking that's going on here. Let me just run through these, and these will be fodder for our discussion. If you Google SHRM 2007, the state of diversity, the workforce diversity in America, it's the most extensive research on what corporations are doing around diversity and inclusion initiatives. 1,500 companies, 1,500 HR diversity professionals, companies who are at the top of the game and the reputation around diversity and inclusion. You Google that study, you can download it, 75 pages, but let me give you the 2 conclusions. One, the term diversity is not understood, and the business value is not clear. And this is following 20 years of exponentially better business case for diversity. So I want to use that as a framework of what's not happening. Because when I'm with professionals, with professional respect, I will tell them from my perspective, if we continue to do what we're doing, we're trying to do the right thing, but the impact is not going to be what we're all wanting to have. We're going to be here 100 years from now having this same discussion because something is not being transferred in the pathology of management and organizational culture. So, first thing, the term diversity. It really is human and organizational. So when we say diversity, it's now being used as a code word for race and gender. So when you're talking about diversity, get real clear, are you talking about racial, ethnic, gender diversity? And if you are, call it. Call it. But once you hear someone say diversity, you got to get real clear with them, what are you talking about? Because everybody will tell you it means broad, but it's not being used that way. Secondly, organizational. There's probably more tensions around organizational differences, or just as much, and I can't empirically prove this, but I think there's just as much around organizational tensions of diversity than human. And I'll use Georgia Power Southern Company as an example. We are a good operating company, Southern Company and Georgia Power. So Georgia Power is the largest subsidiary under the Southern Company. But let's take Georgia and Alabama Power. And it's amazing in my 37 years with the company how uninviting the Georgia Power folks were folks who came from Alabama. And vice versa. And we're working for the same company in the same industry because there's this organizational arrogance. And so, and again, I'm being very transparent here because we're improving this. How much better can our company be if the good ideas that are moving across from Birmingham to Atlanta, so the good ideas that leave Birmingham when they get to Atlanta don't seem to be good ideas, and the good ideas that leave Atlanta to go to Birmingham, they don't seem to be good ideas when they hit Birmingham. How much better could we be if we could understand that organizational difference? And no, the solution is not cementing the Chattahoochee River. That's not the filter. Sustainability. Sustainability will only occur by changing management and organizational culture. Now let me make something that's very invisible, transparent, if you haven't figured this out. Organizational culture in America today is white, male, heterosexual, Christian, temporarily able-bodied. And depending on where you are, if you have a financial, legal, engineering degree, that's important, that technical know-how, and if you like barbecue and have high cholesterol, that's icing on the cake. I mean, that is really. That is the organizational sweet spot. So stay with me on this. The unspoken rules of culture. That's the comfort. So as a white, I'm in every one of those categories. I am doing things that I have no idea I'm doing because I have no idea what it's like not to be in my life form. I'm thinking everybody in the world has my experience, and I don't know what I don't know. African American men, you understand what it's like not to be white, but do you understand what it's like not to be female? And I'm hearing an affirmation. I'm hearing for African American women, since you said no. You understand what it's like not to be white, not to be male, because you have to understand us better than we understand ourselves in order to survive. But if you're heterosexual, you understand what it's like not to be heterosexual, homosexual. Or if you're a Christian, do you understand what it's like not to be Christian or secular? And so as a result of me not knowing those others, I have misinformation. I have all these good intentions, but you can tell if I get it or not. And as a result of that, there is a different standard of performance. I did not understand this until recently. So, if I am a white male, my white male counterparts, subconsciously, I was coming into this that I got the benefit of the doubt that I could do the job until I prove otherwise. Everyone else, you could not do the job until you proved you could. And that's because of all that misinformation I had, that lack of trust. And then if you did 100 things right, the 101st time you did wrong, I default all the way back to, darn it. But same thing now. So if you're a heterosexual African-American female, you may have that same different standard of performance for those. So I guess what I'm saying, whatever you're not, if we don't understand what it's like to be in that person's shoes in the organization that we're working for, and if I'm not understanding how I build trust, am I unconsciously creating a standard of performance that's unfair, that's creating mistrust, and at the end of the day is creating disengagement, less performance, and how in the world are we going to tackle those megatrends that I talked about before? You have to change, you have to affect management and organizational culture affecting diversity and inclusion. Second thing, it's got to be, sustainability can only be by including and benefiting all, including white men. Because right now, and I want y'all to hear this, we're trying to do the right thing in the profession. We're trying to teach the right thing, but the manner in which we're teaching it is pushing folks in my life form farther and farther back into the cave. Because it's coming across, you're fixing Frank. I will tell you, I am not the problem. I am challenged in a lot of ways because I do not understand the systemic advantage I have being who I am. That's the problem. But it's not me. And so I think sometimes we're going to really understand intent versus impact. And while I'm at it, when you hear the word privileged, you know, you're a privileged white guy, Frank. When I hear that, the hair on the back of my neck goes up. Because I couldn't decide if our family was upper low class or lower medium class. I mean, we were not, and so I had to work my ass off to get what I had, to go to school, to be the first in the, second in the family to get college. Now, I didn't realize that because I am who I am, I had a pretty good benefit, systemic advantage that others did not have. So instead of using the word privilege, think of it systemic advantaged. And so again, I've already talked to you all about everybody in this room has some form of systemic advantage, because systemic advantage is I never have to think about being heterosexual. I never have to think about being Christian. I never have to think about being temporarily able-bodied. And as a result of that, am I getting a benefit in my lights? Am I dying, or is that it? Is that the close? And now, last thing, then we're going to open up for questions. Last thing, we're going to open up for questions. When I came to work September 11th, 1972, and I saw some of the gasp, I saw some of the macro inequities, some of the generational challenges with some of y'all when Doctor told you how many years I had with the company. At the time, there was very few blacks working in the company. The few blacks who were there, they were either driving someone's car or they were in the back of a truck somewhere trying to get into the cabin to get heat. Very few women. And the women who were there were either secretaries, we use the term secretaries, or home economists. So it was basically white men. The issues that we're trying to work on with diversity and inclusion today are the same issues that we've had in management and organizational culture when the only ones who were there were white men. So here's the difference. So here's why I say that. 72, if I did not get a job, I would say, you know what, Mike's a good guy, but he's not as good as I am. Hang with me. Don't let the light bother you. So he's not as good as I am. For someone from Georgia Power, when the lights go out, that really causes that hair is going up on the back of my neck right here. But as a white male, I would sit there and say, Frank's a good guy. He's not as good as I am. So it's not what he knew. He knew George better than I did. So it's not what you know, it's who you know. I was also told within the first 2 weeks, do not challenge management in an open setting. Now, what's happened through the years, and I'll share our representation numbers, we've increased representation dramatically. So now, if I'm a white guy, if I don't get the job, well, I didn't get it because of race, gender, ethnicity, this diversity thing. Or if you're other than white men, if you don't get a job, the Good Old Boy Network's in place. What's the root cause? We haven't been honest with each other on how you give and receive performance and career feedback. So I was probably doing things I didn't deserve to get a job. But somebody wasn't being honest with me to tell me why, what it was, what I had to do, because not only Georgia Power, but in corporations on whole, corporations do not do a good job of giving honest, direct, quality, ongoing job and performance feedback and career feedback. And so I was substituting, and we're all substituting something in the equation that may not be true. The other part, and let me share this, the management numbers. There was a time in the company where we had 18,000 employees working for the company. Today we got 9,000. Over the last 15 years, we've decreased our workforce by 25%. And doing that, we become a low-cost producer. We're seen as an industry leader in customer service, reliabilities, all those standards. Over the last 15 years, while we've decreased our workforce by 25%, we've increased, and when I use the word minority, I'm talking about African American and ethnic representation. And primarily African American, because we're beginning the journey of increasing ethnic representation in our company. We've increased minority population by 10%, women 7%. We're a company that is a heavy construction company, so 40% of our workforce are craft labor. We build power plants. We run transmission lines. So when you hear our numbers, it's not an apple-to-apple comparison to, say, SunTrust. They're a financial institution. They don't have a construction company. Overall representation in our company today, minorities is 27%, females 23%. For management level 7 and above, and when I say management level 7 and above, this is a significant leadership position. For minorities, 17%. For women, 20%. For officers, I'm one of 30 officers in the company. For minorities, is 20%. For females, is 24%. Board of directors, minority and female representation is 27%. And for the last 15 years, new hires have ranged for anywhere between 45 and 55% consistently every year for the last 15 years when we were hiring for women and minorities. Now, I will tell you those numbers compare very favorably with anybody in corporate America. But here's the deal, and this last thing I'm going to hush and we'll open up for questions. If we don't have that relationship, so if we don't see this as a one-on-one, so in other words, if this is not seen as a function of management, and here's how we're defining success in our company. It's not only representation increases, but success will be defined by the individual employee. So it doesn't matter if Georgia Power Company or Southern Company is on some best list somewhere. If there's not a relationship between an employee and their manager, and remember what I said, it doesn't matter what your human dimension of diversity is as a manager or as an employee. But if there's not some kind of trust proposition between the manager and the employee, and it's not from the manager's good intention, but from the employee's perspective, is the manager seen as trustworthy? Trustworthiness is based on how well you give and receive performance and career feedback. Why I give the whys behind decisions. And if you don't understand the why, how you are able to disagree without fear of retaliation and conforming. Because you can have nirvana around representation, but if everybody is being conformed to groupthink, or if everybody's being conformed to adapting to their manager's level of comfort to deal with them, what good is that visible representation? Because we're not getting the benefit of it. Y'all with me? Last thing, how many of y'all work in corporations today? Okay, by show of hands, how many of you all have heard that, you know what, I'm afraid to say that because I'm worried about some kind of retribution or retaliation? How many of y'all hear that? And I'm not talking about legal standards. So let me tell you something. This idea of diversity of thought, if you don't work on how you're able to develop skills to lower fear of retaliation, to build trust non-legally, and here are the two drivers. One, conforming to groupthink. So if you get too far outside of groupthink, you get retaliated. And we can tell you all the forms of retaliation, how you get excluded. Or if you don't adapt to your reporting manager and make them comfortable with you, instead of them adapting what you need to be successful, those are the two quicksand areas. So you're going to have to manage your organizational culture of how you do that. And it doesn't matter if you're white, black, doesn't matter what your ethnic dimension of diversity is, doesn't matter what your gender is, everybody has to maneuver through that. What questions do you have? And those are just to get the pump primed for discussion. Yes?
I have two questions. How often do you do employee surveys and in what format?
Yes.
And the second question is, how do you educate or train your staff on diversity both from a human level and organizational?
Thank you very much. The two questions are what kind of survey mechanisms do we have and how often? And then how do we educate employees on human and organizational diversity? Let me go to the first question first, or the second question first. In our company, we have 5 mandatory, now listen to the terminology, employee and management development. Management and employee development. If you say training, training is a checkoff. Training, I can come into a training session, I can hear you say something, and I can say, this is the biggest bunch of BS, and I can walk out the door, and I just continue to do whatever I was doing. Development means at some point there's going to be an accountability and an expectation that you apply what you're being taught, or somehow you are disqualifying yourself to take on higher levels of management authority. So the 5 are: 1, basic diversity 101. All the misinformation that we have about each other, and that's the big diversity, wide diversity, and in that session, you learn about organizational, and that's for everybody in the company required. The second is how we call it managing differences. So this is anytime you become a manager or supervisor for the first time, you go into an all-day mandatory training of how you develop adaptive leadership skills. So I adapt to employees instead of employees adapting to me, because as a manager, it is my responsibility to get 100% out of employees and manage the culture. The third is how we raise awareness on non-legal retaliation. It's another management skill. We teach 3 skills in this training of how you build trust, reduce fear of retaliation. The next 4th mandatory development is how you give and receive performance feedback. And then the 5th is job selection, the mistrust that folks have, and it's not around the processes of job selection. Because if you want to have an Olympics on processes, Georgia Power will be gold every single time. We have processes. But the mistrust is the employees have with managers who have control of those processes. So we're showing in the 7-step process, here's how you build better communication. Here is where race, ethnicity, and gender can be considered. And in this, you do not use a job selection process to tell an employee something that their immediate supervisor didn't tell them. And so we're aligning communication and performance feedback between the job selection. So those are the 5, that's how we're doing it. And that's how we're changing management and culture through those 5. That's part of it, but those 5 areas right there. The area that we got to work on for the next 5 years is the accountability piece and the accountability in middle management. And that's where we think we have a step towards sustainability. Other questions? Thank you. Other questions?
What about my first one about employee survey?
Oh, employee, thank you very much. We have, let me tell you, we have what we call a culture scorecard. So this is how 26% of officers and their PPP, their performance, 26% of officers' pay is based on this culture scorecard. Has 3 components. The first component is there's 2 different levels of representation. It's management 7 and above, and it's the feeder pool levels 5 and 6 into the 7. And what kind of increase are you making in those areas? The second is around supplier diversity, and that is spend minority and female-owned businesses and what our spend is. And I will tell you, over the last 3 years, our spend has been $1.5 billion. So we're really expanding our supplier diversity spend in our core business. The third area, we have 3 employee surveys, 2 external benchmarks, 1 internal. So the 2 external benchmark, one is the Diversity Inc. So Diversity Inc. does their list of the top 50 companies to work for around diversity and inclusion, and we compare ourselves where we are with that Diversity Inc. The second one is the Fortune 100 Trust Index, 56 questions that's broken out in 5 different areas, and we're able to compare ourselves with our company with those 100 who are in the top 100. And then the third is our internal employee survey. All of this is done each year. The expectation is to improve over the previous year. So there's an expectation on the employee survey. If there's something there, you have a responsibility to go figure out what's in your work environment that's not working and build trust. So those are the 3 areas, and I will tell you that is for the employee survey. Employees will only be honest with surveys if they think management is going to do something with it. Or management is not so much concerned who said it versus what are they trying to tell me and what do I need to do to build effectiveness, leadership credibility, and trust and performance. And so I'm not saying we're there, it's still uneven, but that's the path, that's the journey we're trying to use employee surveys. Thank you. Other questions? Yes?
Being VP of Diversity, what role does empowerment and ethics play in Georgia?
Empowerment and ethics. Great question. So as role of Vice President of Diversity, empowerment and ethics. Let me first of all take a stance on the empowerment. I cannot change management and organizational culture at Georgia Power. If anybody's expecting me to do that, it's a setup. I can't do it. And if you're going to hold me accountable for something you're not doing in the line organization, I'm not going to take. So the empowerment has to be, how am I empowered to be consultants to the operational people to figure out what is it that they don't get around this to improve their performance with their team. The empowerment has to be with line management. Empowerment has to be with the CEO and the top executives figuring out what they want to get out of this, why they think it's important, and how they're going to hold themselves accountable. I can't hold the CEO accountable, but Mike has done a beautiful job of holding himself and other executives accountable and how that translates. The empowerment piece for me as an individual now is, how do I use my white maleness coming out of the operational side, that I'm able to do things because of who I am, my title, because I came out of the operational side. I can do things in the company because I know how things get done. I am what we're trying to change, and I can do a lot of things without asking for permission. And I'm empowered to do it, and I've got the tremendous support from the company to do that. The ethics around this, and I will tell you, I am counter to a business case for diversity. We have more of a business case to build the next nuclear plant. We have more of a business case for our diversity and inclusion than it is to build the next nuclear plant. Here's why I say that. And our company is not so hung up on the profitability angle. The ethics for us is, why do you have to have a business case to treat somebody fairly? Why do you have to have a business case to build trust? If we understand that the workforce demographics are changing, if we understand that the community and the customers we serve are demographically changing, why do you have to have a business case to do what should be done anyway? And if you give me a business case, belief will trump empirical data all the time. So if I truly believe this is a bunch of crap, you can give me all the business cases in the world, and I will use my exquisitely developed white brain to take your business case and slice it and dice it. I will cut your organization. I will make a good business decision not to do this, and I'll go to sleep at night feeling good about myself. And when people say there's got to be a business case, it's a setup, because it's easier to say, well, our affinity group came up with a guacamole chip that served that $300 million to the bottom line. It's easier to say that than it is to change the business case around your management and organizational culture, and the ethics and the empowerment and the business case of how your entire workforce, and I'm not talking about the entire, I'm just not talking about the low levels, but I'm talking about through ranks of management, that the ethnic, racial, gender representation is reflective of all the available skills available for us to do our business successfully. And I will tell you, the empowerment, the ethics, we've increased our representation over the last 37 years. We're still the best. We've increased all that representation. And you know what? We haven't lowered any standard, which is a myth. We've gotten better. And so all this business case to justify something, if you hear too much about a business case, somebody's got a belief there they don't believe this stuff, and there's no business case that's going to trump that belief. So the ethics and the empowerment is just doing this to align these corporate values on the wall and put those corporate values into behavioral demonstration. No other business case. Other questions? Yes?
In addition to the development series that Georgia Power has for diversity and for their management, what other initiatives does Georgia Power use to educate and explore the diversity of their workforce?
Okay, the question, make sure, because I've got hearing aids. I don't know if y'all noticed, I got 2 hearing aids. And so there used to be a time that I would never admit that I couldn't hear the question. I just make up an answer. So in my willingness to be transparent, would you please repeat the question? Because I think I heard what you said, but I want to make sure.
In addition to the development seminars that
Yeah,
you
yeah,
offer at Georgia
yeah.
Power, what other initiatives does Georgia Power take to educate their workforce on diversity?
Great, thank you very much. Let me tell you the journey. For the last 10 years, the first 3 years, if you want to mitigate legal risk, if you want to, and if you have general counsel, and we don't do this, if you have general counsel who is restricting what you want to do with your broad-based initiatives, you're not changing any management or organizational culture. Corporate counsel cannot define what's your broad-based initiative to change management and culture. But if you want to mitigate legal risk, there's 4 areas. Create fairness and transparency in compensation, how you train and develop somebody, second. Third, how you hire and select. And then the 4th is how you create a work environment that's not seen as hostile. That was the building foundation of our initiatives. So we had all these 33 initiatives. The last CEO before the current CEO was seen as the enlightened one. So he was the one that got the 33 initiatives. And David, if you ever met David Ratcliffe, you would sit there and say, David, he's so engaging, and folks would say, David has broad shoulders, he's the enlightened one. And some would say that if David leaves, what we're trying to do around our diversity and inclusion initiatives would crumble. And that scares me. And there was probably some, if we were real honest, saying, David, please leave sooner than later. I want to go back to normal. David leaves. The new CEO, Mike Garrett, comes in. And he is not seen as David Ratcliffe. He's got a different style. Mike did something that was as brilliant as David around the 33 initiatives and separating the legal process from the non-legal management and culture. Mike says, so stay with me, I'm getting to the answer because I just can't give you the bottom line answer. I got to give you some context. Mike says, I was not here for the 33 initiatives. I know folks are holding me to a standard. They want me to act and be like David. I'm not. And I said this to Mike, David has done the easy part. You got to make this stuff stick. And what he did, he had McKinsey and Company to do an assessment. He says, I want to have an assessment. Tell me what the 33 initiatives we're trying to do. Tell me, did we hit the mark? What are the gaps? And I don't think anybody has a tolerance for 33. We got to get it down to about 5 or 6. And so we had McKinsey come in and do an organizational effectiveness around diversity. First time they've ever done this. Folks would ask me, why McKinsey? Because they're not a diversity consultant. If we brought a diversity consultant in, and you know this, the right brain of our company would have said, well, it's a diversity consultant. Whatever conclusion they come out, I'm going to discount it because what? They were supposed to come up with that answer. I got an organizational effectiveness. McKinsey wore our engineering, financial culture out with empirical data. And they compared us to 250 other companies. There was 9 components to organizational effectiveness. And what they ended up out of all that, 6 areas to your question now. Performance feedback. So they said if you want to move the culture, if you want to build trust, you got to have one, you got to improve your performance and career feedbacks. Secondly, you're going to have to continue to build representation because you cannot change a culture unless you've got others in the culture who are different. Third, you got to start working on retention. So for a company that's 4% or less, who's leaving the company at an incrementally higher rate than others? And guess who that was for us? Employees 5 years or less. So they're about 5.5%. They have a hard time figuring out what our family culture is like. The next, you better start building trust around the selection process. Because if you're going to continue to increase representation, you better work on the trust around not the processes, but how you build trust with the job selection. The last 2 was communication. And it's not top-down communication, but it's the why. Here's why we're doing something. And you may not necessarily agree with it, but at least I've been respectful for you to tell you what it is. You may have disagreed, and that's okay, or I may be asking why because I haven't made a decision yet. And then the last one is how we build trust by reducing the fear of retaliation. So our management and culture change are in those 6 areas, and we don't call it diversity and inclusion. But I'm going to tell you something, it's holding us accountable, and I would say it's not letting anybody off the hook, but for our business, the kind of business model that we're in, like I said, we're 10 years into a 40-year culture change process, and we're right on. We know exactly where we're going. We've got our foot on the pedal, and we know what we're going to do for the next 5 years. Other questions? Yes. In our company, if you want to be successful in our company, you've got to have a college. If you want to advance to the top. Now, there are certain levels. Let me back up. To be in management or in certain jobs, it is a requirement to have a college degree. And you got to have technical know-how. So it's finance, business, engineering, legal. And I think that's about it. I mean, yeah. So yeah, you got to work out of certain parts of our organization. So if you take the 30 officers, 90% of the 30 officers came out of one organization, which is a CSO organization. So they understand the distribution, the customer service, the transmission part of the organization. If anybody thinks that you're going to move up our company without coming out of CSO, if anybody thinks you're going to move up our company without moving around the system, those are requirements. Not going to work. You got to be able to do those things. Last couple things. And I hope I've answered some of y'all's questions. Practical to-dos. Now, if you don't understand the unspoken rules of your company's culture, figure out the unspoken rules. And let me tell you what it is. If it was a Myers-Briggs personality, and y'all may have been through that, it's an ISTJ, so here it is. You give somebody the end of the story. Here's the conclusion. Here's how I got there. Here who was involved. And here are the three things you want somebody to do. And you train yourself to think that way, to ask questions that way, and to respond that way. That is one aspect of organizational culture. You got to figure out what your organizational culture is. In order to do that, get mentored. And I'm not talking about formal mentoring. Informal mentoring, and be mentored by someone that you're not. So don't always be mentored by who you're most comfortable with. And I'm going to tell y'all, if you go to Catalyst, 83% of women, both white, black, ethnic women, who've made it to the top of organizations, they were mentored by white men. You all got to take responsibility to get someone to be honest with you about your performance feedback. And don't think that somebody's being honest with you. Because let me tell you, as a white guy, I may be sitting there, if I'm really giving honest feedback to African Americans or women, drama, lawsuit. Or if I'm a white guy, if I'm going to give feedback to this guy, I'm confused about, do I want to be a friend? Because I may go hunt with this guy, maybe our children go to school together, or do I want to be a manager? Nobody's getting honest feedback. You got to take ownership and responsibility of that. Management skills, let's see. Last two things. Understand what you're doing to create mistrust with those who you're not like. And you got to figure out, and I can tell you all kinds of ways I did it, and it's not necessarily pretty, but when you get in that position, do not try to defend, rationalize, or discredit what you're going to hear. Listen to the other point of view. Listen. Fight the resistance to defend. Fight the resistance that I'm a good person, I don't do these things. Yes, we do. Listen, and then you figure out what does trust look like from their viewpoint. Last thing, start at home. Because everybody in this room has got some form of bias, prejudice. And I know for me, I learned all of my biases, prejudices, my subtle forms of racism from those that I loved and trusted the most. My family, my friends, my church, and my school. And we're all teaching this to our children. We may not think we are, and if we're ever going to change this world in a world that is so different than any time in the future, what are we teaching our children that's propagating the divisiveness, the disengagement, the mistrust, the fear, the hatred? And maybe we have to start with our children first, and maybe over 3, 4, 5, 50 generations from now, something will be different than what it is today. Thank you all very much. It's been an honor to be here.